Welcome to VMworld. Good morning. Let's try it again. Good morning. And I'll just say, it is great to be here with you today.
Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhatia, and we are today going to unwrap VMworld with our regular Rob Hirschfeld, CEO of Rack. And Rob, what's interesting is that we actually met at one of the VMworlds. So, I knew you online for a long time, but that's where I met you in person. So, VMware, there's a special connection and relationship there. So, it is important even for me. I really miss it in person because it's the community to hang out with friends and all those things. So there's nothing we can do about that. But let's unwrap it. There are a lot of announcements, some acquisition. One thing that I want to know, specifically last year, their CEO, he had special focus on that we are going to talk about open source a lot. We did not do a lot of good work in open source. We are going to talk a lot about that. So I want to talk about three aspects. Of course, their new announcement, projects, acquisitions, and focus on open source. So let's start.
I'm happy to, and you're absolutely right about missing the in-person event. What's interesting is that this event, which is normally 20,000 people or larger because of all the ancillary venues and pieces that go on, it's one of the largest industry conferences is out there. And the flip side of that is that it was actually a larger conference in pure numbers. So what I heard is 100,000 people were involved, signed up and registered, but the degree of interaction was much, much lower. And I was participating in Discord servers, right? We hosted a watch party, we had all sorts of things. People just aren't as engaged. So there's a lot of VMware giving content that we should talk about, but we are still missing something in these virtual formats.
I think what I have noticed as a media person, plus somebody who also goes to event, there are two things that happen. Number one is that when we go to an event, we are pretty much locked, right? There's nothing else we can do. So you can either be at the venue, hang out with people, or go back to your hotel and or of course, go and see, sightseeing. But then you have a guilt that, hey, I am here, I can meet all those people. There's no kind of, I'm not saying it in a negative way, but there's no escape. You're kind of locked into that environment. So when you go, get ready, go to a venue, you want to utilize your time. Versus when you sit at home, there are so many things to do. The idea is that you have to go online to interact. That you do regardless. So there's no incentive. There is nothing forced there. So that is why it has a big impact. Second thing is, as Steve Jobs used to say, that if you ask people, they would want a faster horse. So what is happening with this I don't call them virtual events, I call them online events, because they are trying to recreate the in-person experience through the tools. That's not how it works. I would have ideally wanted to put up my virtual gear when I can actually interact with my Oculus Go. So there are so many components that play a big role in this decreased interaction. That's what I think.
We're a long way from your Vive index, your index, your Oculus being the avenue for interacting. This is exactly why we set up the 2030.cloud. Because
let's talk let's do like that. Continue.
We should do the interviews entirely like this. I'm in favor. But that's why we set up the 2030.cloud. Because we wanted that hallway track experience where we can pull these things apart. And that's the challenge that we have here is that every ounce of content is effectively vendored. Now, I was in vBrownBag, and vBrownBag is a little bit more open, but it was still predominantly, vendors talking about the products. And don't get me wrong, we need that. That is an important part of these conferences, but it is not the only part of the conferences. And so I do think that as an industry, our ability to meet and discuss and think about the ramifications is really, really important. And I do that a lot. That's why we're having a conversation about what's coming, what they talked about, and where it fits. Because there are still some really big announcements and things that VMware has done and is announced doing in this VMworld.
Right. There's a huge list. So let's start with, they made a lot of announcements. What was something that, got your attention?
So the biggest surprise to me was Project Monterey. which is, on the surface, it sounds like SmartNICs and SmartNIC and SmartNIC. And a lot of people dismiss SmartNICs as basically a programmable network controller. And the thing that was really notable here is that VMware really came out with a lot of partners here on something that is really a supervisory card for a server. And if you've been watching AWS has something called Nitro that they put a lot of technology investment in and really use deeply in their cloud. And it's the idea that I'm going to have basically a second computer that supervises the main computer. And for that, they run all of the hypervisor functions and the network allocation functions and storage functions and potentially even memory functions on this supervisory card. And so a lot of the I/O can be abstracted, effectively virtualized, although the host, it looks like it's an actual card or device. And so this VMworld really shifted the focus here to saying we are going to be building effectively a next generation of computer where the supervisory functions are run in a supervisory computer attached to the main server. And the target for that supervisory computer is the SmartNIC. I would tell you that it's still very early days, right? RackN, because we deal with hardware, we see some of the people who are building SmartNIC infrastructures and trying to attach SmartNIC infrastructures, and there's a lot of questions about how they're managed and how the standards are and how they work, which I completely get. Clearly, Amazon is doing this. The rest of the industry has to respond, and once I sort of thought through the process, it's reassuring to see VMware, which has such a presence in the rest of the market, having a very concrete answer to, we are going to be using these supervisory cards in a very deep way in computers. And it could reflect a new generation of innovation at the hardware level. So it's a pretty profound potential starting point.
And if you look at, what kind of support will be there for smart NICs, because if you look at the whole VMware Cloud Foundation.
All these details. You
like details. You love details.
I love details, and this isn't going to have a lot of them, unfortunately. We're still sort of in the early days, so there's very clear intentions that VMware will be moving the supervisor to SmartNICs and presenting that as an option. And there's a ton of use cases where it seems like it would be a good idea. And we could spend an hour just talking about these potential use cases, and I listened to VMware doing exactly that. But there's a whole bunch of things that aren't clear. How do you manage it? How do you install it? What if these use cases are actually worth the cost for the intended audiences? Who the standard vendors are for these smart NICs? Are there standards for the smart NICs and how they operate? The funny thing is I was split screen streaming the VMworld conference and Open Network and Edge Summit, where I actually talked there also. And in that, they were also talking about smart NICs and trying to create standards and automation in smart NICs. And the exact same vendors were on the ONES stage talking about smart NICs also. So it's clearly a thing. They didn't have any better answers at this point. So if you're a VMware user, I wouldn't run out and buy a whole bunch of smart NICs and think that you're going to be deploying this. We should really pivot back to Tanzu, their Kubernetes pieces, because I think what I saw was last year, and this is pretty typical for VMworld, last year they had a whole bunch of announcements about this really cool new technology. Not a lot of answers on the specifics there. And this year that got much more concrete in how that would look.
Talking about Tanzu and Kubernetes, I also want to talk about open source, because last year, there was a lot of focus on that. We'll talk more about open source. Looking at their press announcement, I did not see any announcement specific to open source project. Also, the thing is that open source has become kind of so ubiquitous that it's in everything. If you take Tanzu or whatever. So, but it's still, do you think something has changed there, or they still have the same focus?
So they really are investing very heavily in Kubernetes, and so when they came into the Kubernetes community and they acquired Heptio, that really boosted the open source components, credibility, their engagement when they acquired Pivotal. Pivotal is based on Cloud Foundry, which also has a lot of open source pieces. And so I really do think that they are doing more open source because they're participating in these open source markets. They're doing things where they are showing leadership in those areas. I wouldn't say that they've pivoted into becoming an open source company by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm not sure the market really, outside of the people who are really focused on open source, care that much. So, if you're an open source person, I'm sorry if this hurts your feelings, but it's most of the people who are buying VMware and looking for VMware to run in their enterprise, they want it to be open source and they'll talk about it being open source. What they really want it to do is run reliably. They still buy it from a vendor and they still expect it to be supported. So it's not as clear that, the VMware user community is out measuring how many commits VMware has made into the Kubernetes community foundation. Inside the community, they care a lot, but it's not clear that the customers are really motivated by it.
Right, I fully agree with you because customers care also. You can have all that open source that is there in the world. You can grab it, install it. What about day two? That's where the problems start. So that's where, whether it's Reckon or VMware, that's what you guys help. So, but that said, sometimes people use open source just as a marketing term to get mind share. Because even if you say you're an open source company, but if we have had this discussion for so long, you and I have, that with cloud. So that is not relevant, but supporting the open source ecosystem is critical because, whether you talk about Tanzu or any other product, Heptio, they all are based on open source. So you do need that healthy open source ecosystem. Now, talking about Heptio, I think they also plan to acquire Saltstack. What do you make of that?
They did announce that acquisition of Saltstack. I have a lot of respect for the Saltstack team. They've actually built a really nice product. The challenge is, and you can't mention the Saltstack acquisition by VMware without also mentioning the Chef and Opscode going off the market through acquisition also. And so it's very clear that the configuration management space as a pure play configuration management platform is not a standalone technology in that sense. And so, VMware's acquisition of Salt, is really an augmentation for vRealize, although it's not even clear to what extent vRealize is going to be re-architected from that perspective. So of the acquisition announcements, that one seemed pretty logical to me, but didn't feel like it moved the needle very much. Now, you might find a vRealize expert and somebody who's really invested in that tool chain that's very excited about Salt. I don't see it having particularly profound repercussions or even changing the VMware product line very much. One thing to note that a lot of people don't think about is Salt actually does a lot of very good networking configuration and automation. And so it's possible that Salt and NSXT, which is their networking stack, and some of the physical networking work that's starting to get done could become more tightly integrated. But we really don't see a lot of what I would call converged automation stacks at the moment. The other thing that's of note here is the extent to which VMware has managed to penetrate the public cloud market. So they made a point of this, although it's been baked in now for a while, but VMware is running as a material option and growing in all of the major cloud infrastructures. And so, I go back 10 years in the early OpenStack days, and VMware couldn't figure out how to work with the service providers in a way that created a market for them. And looks like they figured it out. So, as much as people want to say, oh, nobody cares about VMware anymore, people care about VMware still. And that's a very real thing. And we see it on these public cloud infrastructures. And if it wasn't a material thing, they wouldn't be doing it.
Rob, thank you so much for taking your time out again and talk about this unwrapping of VMworld. As I said, I wish we could have done it in person, but we have to do with whatever cards we are dealt with. So once again, Rob, thank you.
Thank you, Swap. It's a pleasure to be here. We'll have to dub in some crowd noise just to make it more authentic.
Here,